It is my pleasure to be able to introduce our presenter tonight, Bob Kann. Bob is a man of many talents. He's a professor of education, professional storyteller, juggler, magician, and as if that weren't enough, he's also the author of approximately 25 books and manuals for children and adults, including 6 Badger biographies put out by the Wisconsin Historical Society Press, including one on Joyce Westerman, who was a Kenosha native and a member of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. So without further ado, would you please welcome Bob Kann.
Thank you. Well, as Phil mentioned, I'm the author of this book, Joyce Westerman, Baseball Hero, published by the Wisconsin Historical Society Press in 2012. This presentation is actually part of a series of presentations I'm going to be giving during the next 5 months that are partially funded by the Wisconsin Humanities Council and the National Endowment for the Humanities. And I've been instructed to tell you that any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this project do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities. In other words, anything I say they're not responsible for, which could be a wise thing. I worked as a roving entertainer at Summerfest for 10 years, and anything could kind of come out of my mouth at any point in time. Tonight, I'm privileged to share with you stories about growing up during the Great Depression, about life on the home front during World War II, about the changing roles of women in society, but most of all, stories about baseball. From 1943 to 1954, Joyce Hill Westerman and 36 other women from Wisconsin were among the more than 550 women from Canada, the United States, and Cuba who played professional baseball in the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, depicted in the movie A League of Their Own. They left their homes, their families, their jobs, and sometimes school to do something they loved to do, play baseball. Although they were paid to play, many of them said they would have played for free. By playing in the league, these women tested their physical and emotional limits and expanded them in the process. They played hard, they played well, they played competitively, and they played to win, and the fans loved them for it. Tonight, what I'm going to do is tell you how the league was formed, how the girls, at least some of them, got interested in playing ball, how they developed skills to become good enough to become professional baseball players, how they heard about a league that had never existed before, what life was like for some of them playing in the league, and then what happened to their lives after the league. So shortly after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in 1941, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, the commissioner of Major League Baseball, went to President Roosevelt and asked him if Major League Baseball should continue playing games while the war was going on. President Roosevelt, who was a baseball fan, said definitely, that the workers at home are going to need recreation, and diversions in baseball would be a good one. So Major League Baseball continued in 1942, but at the end of that summer, more than half of the players were now enlisted in the military. P.K. Wrigley, of Wrigley Chewing Gum fame, owned the Chicago Cubs, and he began to worry that when the war was over, fans would stop coming to the ballparks if it took a long time for the war to end. So he had this idea that maybe he could start a women's baseball league. Softball and baseball became wildly popular during the 1930s during the Depression. By the 1940s, it was estimated there were more than 40,000 girls' softball league teams in the United States and in Canada. And baseball in particular was wildly popular in the Chicago area. So Wrigley thought he'll form women's baseball teams, a baseball league. They could play in Wrigley Field and in the major league stadiums, and fans will keep coming. Well, before long, they realized they weren't going to draw enough fans to fill big ballparks like Wrigley Field, so eventually they decided to start small. The league began in 1943 with 4 teams from the Midwest: the Kenosha Comets, the Racine Bells, the Rockford Peaches, and the South Bend Blue Sox. There was gas rationing going on during those years, so they could travel by train in the Midwest to go from one city to another to play the games. The idea behind the league is the girls would play like men but look like women. What this meant was the game began as a combination overhand baseball that the men played and fast-pitch softball like the women played. They still use this ball, this size, 12 inches. The pitching was fast-pitch underhand. They moved the pitcher's mound further back to encourage there to be more hitting. They made the base pass longer. During the 12-year history of the league, every year they tinkered with the rules of the game to try and make it more exciting and to make it more interesting to the fans. So in 1943, this was the size of the ball, and it got smaller and smaller until by 1954, it was this size, exactly the same size that the men used. The pitching began fast pitch underhand. In 1946, they allowed the pitchers to do some modified sidearm. In 1947, they could pitch sidearm. In 1948, they began pitching overhand, and they continued that until the league folded in 1954. So that meant every year for the players who lasted throughout the league, there were changes going on every year. And for Joyce Westerman, this was particularly challenging because she was a catcher, which meant she was catching balls coming from a pitcher throwing from a different distance. She had a different distance to throw runners out at the bases, and she was holding a ball different sizes. P.K. Wrigley had his Major League Baseball scouts travel throughout the United States and Canada looking for the best female baseball players. They identified 280 players. They invited them to Wrigley Field for tryouts. They picked 60 players. They divided them up amongst those 4 teams I mentioned, and the league opened in 1943. So that they looked like women, though, they were forced to wear skirts. So this is a photograph of Joyce wearing her uniform in 1945, and as you could see, she had to wear a skirt. The women hated wearing the skirts, because if you would slide, and those fields back then were not well manicured like today, there were stones and cinders and hard ground, it hurt. And there's a photo you could see over there of one of the women with a very, very bloody thigh, which was very, very common. I'll talk about that a little more later. In the early days of the league, the women had to attend charm school, taught by the staff of the Helena Rubinstein beauty salons, whose chain of beauty salons made her name synonymous with the female ideal. They had to learn how to stand properly, how to walk properly, how to sit properly, how to use utensils properly, how to put makeup on, how to choose clothing. Most of the women thought both wearing the skirts and having charm school was ludicrous. Some of them kind of appreciated the lessons because they were learning things that they never knew before. So that's the background for the formation of the league. The league peaked in terms of interest in 1948. There were 10 teams. The attendance was about 1 million by the end of the season throughout the league. In 1949, they took 2 of those teams, the Springfield Sallies and the Chicago Colleens, and instead of having them compete with the other teams, they became 2 touring teams who traveled in 26 states playing against each other for 3 purposes. One is they took the newer players who were trying to develop their talent, and this was the league. It was kind of like their minor league or farm system to train them. Second thing was it gave the league a lot of exposure. And the third reason was at these exhibition games, they would have tryouts so that local players could try out to try and make the league because they were constantly looking for new players. So that's the background behind the league. So how did the girls get interested in playing baseball? How did they develop the requisite skills to be good enough to play professional baseball? How did they hear about the league? Well, their stories were very different. Let's start with Joyce. Joyce was born in 1925 in Kenosha. When she was 5 years old, her uncle threw a ball to her, and she caught it. And she threw it back to him, and they began to play catch. And Joyce was hooked. She loved baseball. And she began to dream. She began to dream about becoming a professional baseball player. Even though there wasn't a professional league for girls back, or women back then, it didn't stop Joyce from dreaming, and many of the other girls as well. When Joyce was 6, she attended Roosevelt Elementary School in Kenosha. She played baseball with the boys at recess, and she was better than them. And she was embarrassed because girls were not supposed to be better than boys. During that same year, the Depression was starting to take root. Her father had been working at what was then called Nash Motors. Eventually it became American Motors. He worked on the assembly line. People weren't buying cars during the Depression. He got laid off. Joyce's mother baked bread and rolls, and Joyce and her older sisters went door to door selling them, but they couldn't get enough money, and the family lost their home. They moved to a ramshackle house in the country owned by her uncle and her grandfather that was only half finished. No running water, no electricity, potbelly stove that heated it, and Joyce loved it. She had 100 acres of land to romp on. She and her siblings would follow the trains, and when they dropped coal, they would gather it up to feed it into the potbelly stove. Joyce loved everything about living in the country. When she was 8 years old, she became her father's best helper. She could work one end of the two-handed saw. She could change spark plugs on a car. When Joyce was 10, she and her siblings worked 8 hours a day during the summer, picking strawberries and tomatoes and pulling weeds at a neighbor's farm to help raise money so the family could survive during the Depression. When she was 12, one of her aunts, who was 10 years older than Joyce, invited her to play on a softball team with her friends. Joyce said sure. Joyce played catcher in a league with all the girls 10 years older than her, and she found out she was still just as good as they were. When she was 17 years old, Joyce graduated from high school. By now it was 1943, and Nash Motors was open again, only now they were making parts for airplanes for the war effort. Joyce wanted to get a job there where her father and sisters were working, but she had to be 18 to work there. So for 6 months, Joyce worked on the farm with her uncle. When she was 18, she went to the employment office at Nash Motors, asked for a job. They said, come back another time. We've got plenty of workers. Because while the war was going on, a lot of the people from the South came up to Kenosha and the industrial belt and were looking for jobs. Day after day, Joyce went back every day. They kept saying, come back, until finally she said they got sick of seeing me and they gave me a job. So Joyce got a job working on the assembly line, polishing pistons. And in the summer of 1944, she played on the company softball team, the first organized baseball she'd ever played. And one of the scouts from the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League saw Joyce play. And because of that, Joyce was invited to play for one weekend for the Kenosha Comets, the local team, which had had some injuries, and they needed somebody just to fill in for a weekend. And that was Joyce's opportunity. We'll get back to the rest of Joyce's story a little bit later. So that's how Joyce wound up starting to play baseball. Her friend Anastasia Stash Batikis was from Racine. And Stash said she began playing when she was in elementary school. She said, I was interested in playing ball since 3rd grade. I especially enjoyed watching the men play baseball on the playgrounds. When I got old enough to join our rec department league, I played on softball teams in the city leagues. That's all that was offered to girls. I was on the playgrounds and in the parks, before school, after school, and on weekends. During her sophomore and junior years, during 1943 and 1944, the Racine Bells now had a team that was playing, and Stash went to watch them. In 1945, she tried out, and she played center field for the home team, the Racine Bells, which was one of the highlights of her life. Jean Havlish was from St. Paul, Minnesota. She said she began playing at an empty cornfield kitty corner from her home in St. Paul. She later said, all my life, I can't ever remember not playing baseball. Jean Fout was a girl who grew up in East Greenville, Pennsylvania. She said she spent hours and hours as a kid taking stones and throwing them and seeing if she could hit a telephone pole. It must have helped her because she eventually became the greatest overhand pitcher in the league, eventually becoming the player of the year twice, pitching 2 perfect games, 4 no-hitters, and having a reputation as being this phenomenally talented and capable pitcher. The story of Gloria Cordes Elliott epitomizes the innumerable challenges these girls faced just to play baseball. So Gloria was born in Staten Island, New York. She was the 8th child in a family of 11. And at a young age, she began playing sports with her older brothers. If they played baseball, she played baseball. If they played football, she played football. Well, when they started playing in an organized church league, she asked if she could play, and they said, no, you can't play because you're a girl. So she went to the pastor. She said, can I play? He said, no, you're a girl. She kept badgering him. He finally said, okay, you can play, but you've got to find another girl who will play too. And you can only play if the other girl shows up and she plays too. So that worked for a while for Gloria. But then the boys moved on to play in a police athletic league. She asked if she could play. They said, no, you're a girl. So not to be deterred, she convinced these boys who she'd been playing with since she was very young to let her at least practice with them before they played in their league. However, when they saw that she was clearly better than them, they told her she can't play anymore. Finally, she caught this amazing, amazing break. A boy in the neighborhood who was 8 years older named George Bamberger said that she could work out with him. And she did for several years until he enlisted in the military in 1943. He got out of service when the war ended. He then became initially a minor league baseball player. Then he became a major league baseball player. After his playing career was over, he became a pitching coach. And some people think he is the greatest pitching coach who has ever been involved in Major League Baseball. Finally, he became a manager for the New York Mets and for the Milwaukee Brewers. So that's who is helping Gloria Cordes Elliott learn how to play baseball. Back to Gloria. 1949, she's 18 years old. Her dad reads in the newspaper that 2 of the exhibition teams are going to be playing in Yankee Stadium and holding tryouts. He tells Gloria, she goes, she tries out, she makes the league. She plays in the league for 5 years, the last 3 years as a pitcher, an all-star pitcher who pitches as the winning pitcher in the all-star game, her final year in the league. Many, many of the girls learned how to play baseball like Gloria, playing with their siblings and their friends. Many of them, like Gloria, came from big families. So Ruth Zillmer grew up not far from Janesville in Walworth, Wisconsin. She had 6 sisters and several brothers, and she played in the league for 1 year with the Rockford Peaches. Ellen Babe Arndt came from a farm family of 7 kids just outside of Racine. She also grew up playing ball with her siblings. In 1945, she played with her hometown team. She played with the South Bend Blue Sox. But when the Blue Sox came to Racine the first time, she had the biggest surprise of her life because the local fans hosted Babe Arndt Night. They gave her a bouquet of red roses, and they gave her $50, which was like a week's salary back in those days. By the way, the league paid very well. So when Joyce began playing in the league, and I'll tell you about that later, her first year she was paid $55 a week to play in the league. She'd been earning $40 a week working full-time at Nash Motors. She was getting more than her father was getting paid. So this is throughout the history of the league. Sylvia Ronke grew up from a working-class family in Milwaukee, 8 kids in the family. Her dad was a machinist. Her mom was a stay-at-home mom. She played ball with her brothers. If they played baseball, she played baseball. If they played football, she played football. If they didn't have a football, she said she took one of her dolls, she tore off the head, she tore off the arms, she tore off the legs, and that's what they used for the ball. She described herself as a tomboy who made good. In 1944, she played for her hometown team. I love the names of these teams, the Milwaukee Chicks. And the Milwaukee Chicks, during their 1 year of existence, won the league championship, and Sylvia was instrumental in leading them to the championship, once pitching 2 full games on consecutive days, one of them a one-hitter. She played in the league for about 2 years, eventually got married, adopted 3 children. Her husband died young. She worked at 3 jobs and eventually wound up working as a machinist at Briggs & Stratton. Ellen Dapkus Wolf was from Chicago. She was the 10th child and the first girl born in this family. When she was 19 years old in the year 1943, the league was founded. One of her former elementary school teachers had a father who was one of the scouts in the league. He remembered what a good player she was. He invited her to try out for the league. She said, trying out for the league wasn't a problem. The problem was my mother. She said, my folks were foreign, Lithuanian immigrants, and my mother was very domineering. She hated me being in the league. There was always a big fight every year before I went away again, because she didn't think it was the thing to do. I was a tomboy, and she didn't like that. Eleanor's nickname in the league became Slugger. Her first year, she led the league in home runs. During the next 6 years, she would hit more home runs than any other player in the league. I read a marvelous interview with her when she was 79 years old. And she said she still played ball with the kids in the neighborhood. She'd play catch with them. She'd hit balls with them. She always carried a ball and bat in her car in case there was an opportunity for her still to play. And when she was asked to sum up her experience in the league, she said, outside of having my 2 sons, that was the best time of my whole life. Some of the girls learned how to play at a very young age. They were just natural athletes who were very, very good, and they began by playing fast-pitch underhand softball. Toni Palermo's story is particularly interesting. She grew up in Chicago. When she was 10 years old, one of her PE teachers thought she began playing fast-pitch softball at school. One of her PE teachers said she was so good, she should try out for the professional softball league that was taking place in Chicago then. She tried out, and as a 10-year-old, she began playing professional fast-pitch softball. Somebody from the All-American Girls Professional League saw her. In 1947, they invited her to go to Cuba to try out for the league. I don't know if she went or not, but when she was 14 years old, which was the youngest age they would allow players to play in the league, Toni played in the league for 2 years with those traveling teams. After those 2 years, she was invited to play again the following year, but she had a different idea. Instead, she decided to become a nun, which she did. Through the years, Sister Toni eventually earned 3 master's degrees, an interdisciplinary PhD from UW-Madison. She became a professor both in the departments of social work and health and physical education. Also through the years, she once had an accident, and she was looking through the phone book for somebody to cut her hair, and she was looking through the yellow pages, and she sees this ad for electrolysis, hair removal. She goes, what is that? She goes, that's interesting. So she eventually became an electrolyst. Then she began training electrolysts, and then she became a national certifier for electrolysts. She also became a Mary Kay saleswoman. She was also a choreographer and a dancer. I met Sister Toni at a presentation I gave at the Madison Senior Center about 5 years ago. And she told me that she still has scars on her thighs from sliding on those fields back then. This is now 60 years later since she's been playing baseball. Everything she's got innumerable service awards. And here's kind of a summary of what she said about her philosophy of life. She said, we were not put on the planet Earth to do nothing. You have to look at what you have, share and work to make a difference in people's lives. Make a difference on our planet Earth. So, many of the girls were natural athletes. And once you gave them the opportunity, they just got better and better and better, playing baseball as well as other sports. So as I mentioned, Joyce had basically played no organized ball other than that company league when she was 19 years old before she entered the Women's Baseball League. And she, in her 8 years, just got better and better and better and better. Magdalene Mamie Redman was from Waupun, Wisconsin. She played no organized ball till she was 17 years old, and then she commuted from Waupun to Oconomowoc, played in a softball league. She got noticed by one of the scouts in the league. She played in the league for the next 6 years. When the league ended, one of the managers, Bill Allington, formed a traveling team of girls who for 3 years traveled around the country playing exhibition games against men's team, and more than holding their own. And Mamie Redman played on that team as well. She eventually taught PE and math at Oconomowoc High School for 26 years. Very common for many of the girls, and I'll talk about this later, to become PE teachers after their, or professors of physical education after their stint in the league. Jean Havlish, the girl I mentioned before who grew up in St. Paul across from the cornfield, was this amazing, multi-talented athlete. She was good in baseball, football, basketball, skating, hockey. She said the only sport she wasn't good at was tennis. But her dad was particularly proud of her baseball talents. She said, let's see, when I was 11 or 12 years old, my dad's golfing buddies would sometimes come over. He used to bet them a quarter that they couldn't throw a ball past me in the driveway. He always won. When she was 15 years old, she and her dad read in Parade magazine that there was this professional women's baseball league. They'd never heard of it. Her dad worked for the trains. They took a train down from St. Paul to Chicago. They stayed in what they described as kind of a seedy hotel. The next day they went looking for P.K. Wrigley. They eventually found his offices and found out he no longer owned the league. He had sold it earlier, and there were no longer any baseball teams in Chicago. Not to be dismayed, they went back to St. Paul. After her sophomore of high school year of high school ended, she then took the bus down to Racine. She tried out for the Racine Bells. They were now having individual tryouts for each team, and they told her that it was too late for this season. She should try out the next season. She tried out the next season, 1951. She never heard from the league. Not to be dismayed, 1952, she went to Fort Wayne, tried out for the Fort Wayne Daisies. She went home waiting to find out if she heard. Finally, she received a special delivery air mail envelope. It was an invitation to play for the Daisies. She said, "There was no happier girl in the world than me. I can remember coming home from the movies on Saturday afternoons, and I'd be fielding imaginary ground balls all the way." She wound up finishing high school by correspondence course. She played in the league for 3 years as a shortstop. When the league ended, she still had competitive drive, so she switched to a brand new sport, bowling. In 1987, she became the only bowler, male or female, to be inducted into the Minnesota Sports Hall of Fame. She was also inducted into the International Bowling Hall of Fame, as well as, like all the other women in the league, in the Baseball Hall of Fame. Sophie Kuras was another one of these amazing, multi-talented athletes. She was from Flint, Michigan, known as the Flint Flash. By the time she was 14 years old, she had led her softball team to a state championship. She'd been the most valuable player in the state basketball tournament. She'd broken a pentathlon record in the state of Michigan, and she was a champion volleyball player. One day in the winter when she's 15 years old, some of her friends come to her house and they tell her, hey, there are going to be tryouts for this new baseball league. This is 1943. She looks outside, it's snowing outside. She says, are you crazy? It's snowing outside. They say, no, it's going to be inside the gym. She's very dismissive of it, but they convince her to go. She's wearing a skirt, she's wearing a sweater. She doesn't change clothes in the least. She tries out and she makes the league. Her father is opposed to her playing in the league. He reads about it in the newspaper because Sophie and her mother know her father doesn't want this 15-year-old suddenly leaving home playing in a league. But her mother signs the contract, so she goes to Racine. Her first year, she helps lead her team to the championship. She leads her team in home runs. She does fabulous in the playoffs, and she steals 43 bases. During the next 6 years, she would steal no less than 100 bases every year. In 1946, she stole 201 bases out of 203 attempts, more than any ball player in history. Rickey Henderson has the Major League men's record. He stole 130 bases. He was thrown out 42 times, and he played 20 more games than Sophie Kuras did during that 1946 season. Sophie Kuras was the player of the year during that season and helped lead her team to the championship. Here's how one of the other players explained why she was such a good base stealer. They said, Sophie displayed an uncanny talent for reading a pitcher's delivery. She focused on the pitcher's feet and always managed to get a quick start. Sophie had to rebandage her leg every day because the wounds never healed from sliding on those fields, being an aggressive runner. But like many of the girls in the league, she was just brutally tough and committed to playing an all-out kind of game. So she was willing to withstand the pain because that's what she needed to do to excel. So that's kind of the stories of at least a wide variety of the girls and how they got interested in playing baseball, how they heard about the league, and how they developed the talent to play in the league. So what was it like when they actually played in the league? Well, imagine what it must have felt like for these players knowing they had outperformed thousands and thousands of girls their age in order to get picked to play professional baseball. Although many of them were leaving home for the first time and were desperately homesick, they were eager to test their skills, and their exuberance and enthusiasm for the game usually overcame their homesickness. They played because they loved baseball. They loved playing on teams with other girls trying to win. They loved to make a great catch. They loved to feel the contact of the ball against, not this bat. They had wooden bats, knowing it might lead to a base hit. Not the stupid rules and regulations, nor the uniforms, nor the charm school, nor the bloodied legs or the broken bones could stop them from playing baseball. This was their dream come true, and they thrived in it. And they had fun. They had nicknames for each other: Pee-wee, Punky, Pinky, Ducky, Horsey, Squirrely, Bubbles, Runky Dunk. The exuberance and commitment to excellence characteristic of these girls who played in the league was perhaps best exemplified by Fay Dancer, who is from Santa Monica, California. She was the character who inspired the character All the Way May, played by Madonna in the movie. How many of you saw the movie? Most of you did. So Fay was a fun-loving girl both on and off the field. If things were slow during a game, she would do the splits. She played outfield. She would walk on her hands. She would do handsprings. She might flounce up her skirt. They wore elasticized shorts underneath. Off the field, when it was curfew time, she and her friend Levon Pepper Pear would sneak out. They'd go carousing. They'd sneak back up the fire escape and get ready to play ball the next day. The fans absolutely adored Fay Dancer. She told, I thought it was a very funny story. In 1947, one of those fans she was dating was a gangster from Peoria, Illinois. She said one day he drove up in his blue Packard, came out, went up to her and said something like, "Hey, anybody you want me to kill for you?" She thought for a second. She said, "Yeah, maybe the umpire." Her nickname was All the Way Fay because of her all-out style of play. She would do anything to win a game. She'd crash into fences. She'd dive into bases. The reporters had called her a fly-catching machine. They said she could run full tilt in center field, catch the ball over her shoulders, pivot around, wheel, and throw it all the way to home plate on a fly to throw out the runner. And she was absolutely fearless. She said, "The guys would look at our short skirts, then look at our legs, and wonder, how we could slide without taking all the hide off ourselves. Well, we did take the hide off ourselves. I love to slide. She ruptured a disc in one of those slides, and that was the end of her career. She eventually became an electronics technician in California. Joyce had the same commitment to excellence that Fay Dancer had, but Joyce, unlike Fay, who was carefree, Joyce was a worrier. When I interviewed Joyce, she told me she worried much too much. So, last episode with Joyce, I told you she was invited to play that weekend for the Kenosha Comets when a couple of the players were hurt. And she got there and she couldn't believe her eyes. These girls were wearing skirts playing baseball. This was what she called a no-no back then. Back then, women's hemlines were below the knee. The only one who showed her legs was Betty Grable. But Joyce figured, well, if they could do it, she'd do it. So Joyce played that weekend. She batted twice. She struck out both times. And she thought, these are the best baseball players I've ever seen in my life. I'm going to try out for the league. The next year, she tries out in Racine. She's one of 2 of 60 players who try out, who are invited to go to Chicago for the final tryouts. And Joyce is terrified, not of the competition in baseball, of going to Chicago, the big city. She'd only been there once before with her aunt. She didn't know if anyone was going to greet her at the train station or what. She gets there. They did greet her. They take her to the field. There's 2 weeks of tryouts, and she does something just brilliant. She sort of looks around, gets the lay of the land, and she thought, you know, catcher is the hardest position to play. Not many of these girls are going to be able to play catcher. Joyce is this just tough farm girl. By the time she's 14, she's plowing fields, she's driving tractors, she's carrying heavy bags of grain. Although she's small, she's just very, very strong and determined. She decides she's going to play catcher. She takes a leave of absence from Nash Motors in case she doesn't get invited to play in the league. But she does. She's invited to play in the league. 1945, her first season is with the Grand Rapids Chicks. The war is going on, and so before each game, the girls lined up along the third base and first place lines, and they formed a V for victory for the war effort. They played exhibition games at the Great Lakes Naval Station and other military bases. The first year, Joyce hardly plays at all. It's a whole new game. It's organized baseball, let alone a whole new game. And she's very, very quiet. She said if I said more than 5 words to anybody that year, it was a miracle. But she's a hard worker. And she's worried already that they're not going to invite her back because she just loves it. Next year, she's invited back again. Spring training, the war is over. Now you can travel by bus and by train. Spring training is in Pascagoula, Mississippi. Joyce's first time out of Wisconsin and Illinois. The 2 striking aspects of that trip, one was seeing the red soil in the South. Being a farm girl, that was very striking to her. And the other thing is the poverty she saw in the South that reminded her of Kenosha during the Depression. Second year, Joyce plays a little bit, but still not much, and she begins to worry more. She has health problems. She has anemia, she has low blood pressure, and she has a problem as a catcher. It's very natural for Joyce to throw sidearm, but her coaches insisted that she throw overhand, and it just never was natural to her. So she developed what we called, when I played baseball, she developed a hitch, meaning she'd hesitate and then she'd throw. And that hesitation would give an advantage to the runners, and so they stole a lot of bases off of her. And the coaches kept insisting, and it just got worse and worse. So she worried more and more. She didn't play very much. 2 weeks before the season is over, the Fort Wayne Daisies have several injuries. Joyce isn't playing. So this year, Joyce is playing for the South Bend Blue Sox. They loan her to the Daisies. So she gets there, and they want Joyce to practice throwing to second base. So they ask Fay Dancer to just stand here. Joyce is back there catching. A pitcher's just going to lob the ball. Fay should just stand there, and then Joyce will work on throwing it to second base. But Fay Dancer decides to take a nice, easy swing. She foul tips the ball, and Joyce hits Joyce in the face, and she breaks her nose. A couple of days later, and I'll talk about this in a minute, Joyce is playing again. She breaks a finger, so she doesn't play at all for Fort Wayne during those last 2 weeks. Third season, Joyce is invited to play again. Now she's with the Peoria Red Wings. Spring training is in Havana. Joyce and many of the girls take their first plane ride. Joyce likes flying. She refuses to taste the alligator steak that she was offered in Havana. She did like the pineapple. On the way home, the flight home, at some point in time, the plane lurched and dropped a couple hundred feet. Remember, this is 1947 now. Joyce is kind of unfazed by it. Some of the girls scream. A 14-year-old girl who's just starting to play in the league, Dolly Brumfield from Pritchard, Alabama, says, "That was great, do it again." (1947). Joyce is the starting catcher for the Peoria Red Wings. She has a great season. She leads her team in doubles and triples and runs batted in. She's now getting the hang of how to play this game. She does decently as catcher, but she still has this hitch. 1948, Joyce is in heaven. She's now feeling relaxed more, talking more. She's on the same team again. Three of the girls who came back to Peoria again that year rent a house together. Everything is just wonderful. And then Joyce gets traded to the Racine Bells. Joyce says there's no crying in baseball, but she cried. The silver lining was Racine, of course, is near where her family lived in Pleasant Prairie, which is near Kenosha. And so she gets a lot of time with her family. Sometimes she brings the team out to the farm and they play around. Joyce has a pretty good season, but she also has her worst experience in the league. At some point in time during the year, she broke 3 fingers. Very common for catchers in particular to break bones in this game. But the other catcher was even in worse shape, so they asked her to fill in for 1 game. Well, the other team figured out that Joyce, because her fingers were broken, could not squeeze the ball. And so they stole more bases off Joyce that game than ever had happened before in league history. Joyce, when I interviewed her 60 years later, was still embarrassed by that experience, even though it wasn't her fault. And she was angry that they didn't tell the press and the announcer of the game that the reason she couldn't throw them out was because she had 3 broken fingers and couldn't close her hand on the ball. She leads the league in defense that year, but she still has that hitch again. 1949, again, she's with Racine. She has an okay season. 1950 is a big year for Joyce. She gets engaged to get married. Ray Westerman, who also worked at what was then American Motors, and met her at a dance, very much admired her baseball playing abilities. So Joyce told Ray that if we're getting married, we're not going to lose our house like my parents did. So they buy some land from her uncle. They go to the Kenosha Public Library. They take out a book, How to Build a House. They spend 7 years building it, and they live in it for the next 30 years. 1950, Joyce is now playing back again with the Peoria Red Wings. First 2 months, she doesn't play at all. They're scared to have her catch because people were stealing so many bases off of her. But one of the players on the team got pregnant, something that wouldn't happen in men's baseball leagues. And so they shifted players around. And one day they have Joyce play in the outfield. She gets 2 hits and they win. Next day, Joyce plays again. She gets another hit, drives in 2 runs. They win again. Within a month, Joyce is one of the top 10 hitters in the league. At the end of the season, she leads her team in batting. Following year, she's again with Peoria. This time they move her to first base. She's the cleanup hitter, has another great season. 1952, Joyce is thinking about quitting the league. This would be her 8th year. She wants to start a family with Ray, doesn't want to be away summers, but they keep throwing more and more money at her. They offer her $110 a week to play. She's trying to save money to help build this house, to put it into the house, so she agrees to play one last season. She has a good season. She's playing first base. 2 weeks before the season is over, one of the players has an argument with the manager and quits the team. 5 other players quit the team in solidarity with that woman. So they're going into the playoffs shorthanded. To digress for a moment, Joyce was the jackpot for me in terms of being a researcher, because Joyce's hobby during her 8 years in the league was scrapbooks. Joyce gave me the clippings from all 8 years she played in the league. When I interviewed Joyce, who was very modest, it didn't matter to me, but I thought, she was just an okay player, partially because she was just so modest. But when I read the box scores of those games, particularly in the championship series, I realized Joyce was a phenomenally good player at the end of her career. And she was integral in winning every single game her team won in 1952, leading to winning the championship. Here's what Joyce said about winning the championship. She said, "It was unbelievable. I was so excited. Everybody just pitched in. It was desire. We showed people we could do it. We won first because we had the desire to win, and second because we were determined to show the players that left that we could win without them." Well, the league folded in 1954 for a variety of reasons, and the women went back to their regular lives. Many of them played sports and excelled in sports. Very few of them talked about their experience in the league, because unless somebody saw them play, they didn't understand it. So Angie Armato, who grew up in Rockford, watching the Rockford Peaches and dreaming about playing in the league, played during the final season for the Kalamazoo Lassies. After the league, she said, she stopped talking about it very quickly. She said, "No one would ever believe me. I would tell them I'd played hardball, and people would say, I played softball." She said, "Until the movie came out, I avoided talking about it. When I saw the movie, I kind of cried. It was fantastic. It brought back so many memories that I just love it." Well, beginning in the early 1980s, the women who played in the league started having annual reunions, which they still have today. In 1988, the women were inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame in a ceremony. If you saw the movie, they showed parts of it at the end of the movie, A League of Their Own, including some of the women like Joyce, who were really in the league in that last scene. 1992, the movie A League of Their Own came out, and the women suddenly became famous. They've been on the speaking circuit ever since. They've been interviewed. They've been on TV. There have been streets named after them, sports fields named after them. So from 1943 to 1954, the girls of the league played together, they worked together, they competed against one another, and they lived together, sometimes in hotels when they were on the road, and in private residences in their hometown cities. They came to depend upon each other and trust each other. Although there were organizations in the military like the Army Nurse Corps where women had these intense bonding experiences, in terms of civilian life, the experience of the girls in the league was unique, and they knew it. They developed tighter and tighter relationships that have only grown during the past 60-something years. By playing in the league, these girls developed self-confidence, resilience, perseverance, an ease in social situations, and a grittiness that served them well for the rest of their lives. When Joyce left the league, she got a job back at American Motors. But back in 1952, women still weren't welcome back in the workforce since the war ended. So they threw every bad job they could at her to deter her and to get her to quit. She had to weld fenders. She had to lift heavy engines onto the hoist. Joyce said, "They weren't going to get rid of me that easily. I could handle it." And of course, she could. So in 1972, the Title IX law was passed, which opened up thousands of opportunities for girls and women in high school and college to compete in sports. In 1974, Little League Baseball changed their rules so that girls could play. And since then, thousands of girls have had the opportunity to play baseball. If you watched the Winter Olympics on TV and you saw women compete in dangerous and difficult sports like skiing and snowboarding and the biathlon, again, you could see how rich are the opportunities that women have today to play these hard sports. Now, you can't say the women of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League were directly responsible for all these opportunities that women have to play in these sports today. But they did clearly prove that women were tough enough to play in hard sports like baseball. These women represented the best of their generation in terms of strength of character and athletic ability. They were pioneers in the world of women's sports, and they were indeed in a league of their own. Thank you. Before I open it up to your questions and comments, I just want to throw out one general question for you to consider, and feel free to comment on it in this next period. So the women in the league, their job was playing baseball back from 1943 to 1954. I just want you to reflect upon and comment what's happened since then, both in terms of sports and outside of sports. What kind of progress have women made in the workplace, and what are the kind of challenges that still remain? So keep that in mind as we're going through this next period. Ask your questions, make your comments, and the floor is yours. Anybody?
You said the league quit for various reasons. Can you name one of the reasons?
Yeah, so the question was, I said the league ended for various reasons. Can I name the reasons? There was kind of a confluence of factors. One was television. And so men's baseball was televised, and people were more interested in watching the men than the women. Television also meant, in terms of recreational opportunities, people now could stay at home to get recreation instead of going out. Also, the league became decentralized. Initially, P.K. Wrigley owned the league. He was responsible, or his staff was responsible, for all the publicity, all of the recruitment, making sure that there was parity in the league so that it was competitive. When they decentralized it, it was very uneven in terms of the quality of play and the quality of publicity. Another problem was when they switched to overhand, there was a shortage of players. Most of the girls in the United States and Canada and Cuba were used to playing fast pitch underhand. So it was hard to get players who were good, who could play when the game was played overhand. Finally, there was a recession from about 1950 to 54. And kind of all of these factors added up to a reason that ultimately led to the demise of the league. Yes?
You know, the heart of the league was, you know, this part of the country. And in 53, that was the last year of the Wisconsin State League, the D-ball league, the professional league, when the Braves came. So Major League Baseball started expanding more into the Midwest, and that drew a lot of fans.
Yeah, they always had trouble. Once the men came back, it was just difficult to compete with the men's team too. Yes.
You're probably too young, but did you ever see
Thank you.
them play?
I like you already.
Did you ever see the league play?
No. I've seen, it took me a while, but I looked on the internet. If you look for a while, you could actually see there are some films of them playing. So I was born in 53, so I would have been a baby. I really regret missing it. Yes?
1954, I saw the last game the Peaches played.
Really?
And my dad's cousin was on the board of directors.
What was it like watching them?
The pitcher for the Peaches threw a shutout, and the catcher for the Peaches hit a home run over the right field fence. She was a left-handed hitter, so I was wondering if Joyce ever played for the Peaches. I found out it was a different gal.
Joyce was a lefty, though. One of Joyce's sadnesses, she never hit a home run. I think she was a slow runner. Lots of doubles, not lots of triples. A lot of the fields didn't have fences. So if you hit it past the outfielder and you were fast enough, you could get a home run, but not Joyce. So that wasn't Joyce, although she threw right and batted left. Yes? Or were you just scratching? Okay. Yes?
Well, I'm from Peoria, Illinois. And I was born in 54, so, you know, it was at that time. But I think it's interesting. I never heard about these women. Never. In all the years that I went to school and lived there, I don't remember ever hearing about them. I think that's so sad.
Yeah, I do too. I think if it wasn't for the movie, I mean, the ceremony at the Hall of Fame sort of gave them a little bit of fame, but it was really the movie that put them on the map so that a whole lot of people know about them. Joyce didn't talk about it. Joyce's daughters learned that she played professional baseball when they saw her uniform hanging in a closet. And so then by the way, her uniform is now at the Smithsonian. So they then said they wanted her to play. So then Joyce started playing softball. As her daughters grew up, she had 2 daughters, she continued to play with them through their college years, and she eventually also began coaching at Carthage College as well. So but it was, again, it just wasn't talked about because people didn't understand it, and it was just sort of a different part of their lives.
Well, Title IX wasn't invoked until 20 years after
Right.
it finished. So basically, there was a stigma against very parallel to segregation. You know, women's sports really, and if you consider it coming in the 70s, women's sports still has just really kind of gotten into its own. In fact, it's like the University of Wisconsin is the only major university in the United States that doesn't have baseball. And a lot of that is because of Title IX. And
Exactly what it is, because they only had so much budget, so they had to drop men's.
well, they
sports.
got oodles of money.
Back then they didn't, but when Richter was athletic director,
Yeah, but
they needed
they
baseball.
but we're talking about today.
We're talking about what led up to Title IX.
Right, that's why they quit, but they could start it now. They've got the money.
When I went to high school, which was 68 to 71, one of my friends who was a girl told me that there were only 2 choices for girls in terms of sports back then. She could be a cheerleader or she could be in what was called signets, which was synchronized swimming. Otherwise, there were no other opportunities to play sports. You had a hand up there.
I was just curious how many of the players and stuff you interviewed personally, or how much of your research was more from like newspapers and stuff?
It was exclusively Joyce. As I mentioned Tony Palermo at one of my presentations, but it was exclusively Joyce. I met Anastasia Batikis at a presentation I gave in Racine, but that was it. But just Joyce reading, asking questions, newspaper clippings.
Well, who's still alive?
Joyce is. Joyce is 92. She still lives independently in Kenosha near her daughter's house. Her daughter no longer will allow her to shovel and put in light bulbs, but there's a whole lot that she can do. They were born in the 20s a lot, or early 30s, so fewer and fewer, but there are still some. And the reunions eventually were not just the players, but their families, and so they have this sort of extended family of people who they've been
They had a tournament in Radford last summer for the girls' baseball league. They still have some teams that play girls' baseball, and they did have a couple of the Peaches there this past summer in Rockford for the tournament.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Joyce went to the reunion last year. I didn't ask her how many people went, but there's still a sizable portion still there. Yes?
Could you describe what the stadiums were? You mentioned no field, outfield fence, that kind of thing. What was, if you went to a game then, what would you have had to pay for a beer or a hot dog or whatever? How would that era and what they were doing compare to, the fortune you have to go to a ball game today, essentially?
The question was, what were those ballparks like back then as compared to today, both in terms of the field itself and in terms of buying hot dogs, beer, admission, all those kind of things. I'll answer part of your question with a description from Sophie Kuras. This is describing her championship game in Racine in 1946. She said, "We had drawn almost 7,000 people to Horlick Field. It didn't have any fences in the outfield, but people had pulled their cars back there like a drive-in. They were standing on the roofs to get a better view. It was the most exciting game I ever participated in. It was only a 1-0 score, but there was so much hitting, so much action. We were standing on our heads out there, doing everything to catch the ball." So that's at least the outfield. You know, I don't know a whole lot of the details about what it was like. Is there somebody who does know it? Do you know, what do you remember about what it was like?
Fire Stadium in Radford was quite a good field, and it did have a fence. And a pretty good, you know, the stands were well built too.
Do you remember what it cost to go to a game, what it cost to buy a beer?
My aunt paid for the ticket, but I used to go to Packers games for about $3 in Milwaukee. Did you say Joyce was a coach at Carthage?
Yes.
Softball?
Yes.
I went to Carthage in '62.
I think it was probably later than that, although I'm not certain. Yeah. I don't know, actually, but now you've got me curious.
I kind of think the Peaches played in the same ballpark that the Midwest League Rockford team played in.
Yeah.
And I know Horlick Field, it was, the structure, the stone structure was still there in the later 50s, because the high schools played in there. When the Peaches, Rockford Peaches and the Racine Bells, they would play actual league games. I remember seeing them 3 times at the fairgrounds in Janesville, and that's where the D-ball team, the Janesville Cubs played. So that, they played. And I recall, I don't think they pitched from the mound. I think maybe they did. Maybe they might have pitched from the slope of the mound. And the baseball at that time was about mid-size. And that would have been in the later 40s.
Sure.
I remember seeing that. 3 or 4 times they played there. But I don't remember them ever playing a town team like a softball team.
Yes.
Am I correct in assuming that all the women were Caucasian?
It's a great question. Not quite. So here's the deal. They initially decided that they were going to follow whatever the protocol was from the Men's Baseball League. So I think it was 1947 that Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier. But they had some sort of peculiar definitions, because remember they had spring training in Havana in 1947, and they decided, in fact, if Cuban women were light-skinned, that would be acceptable. So beginning in 1948, there were 8 women from Cuba who played in the league for various lengths of time, but only if they were light-colored. A couple of African-American women tried out for the league, but they didn't let them in, not because of their skills, because by the time the color barrier had been broken in Major League Baseball, the league was already starting to get on kind of shaky financial footing. And the owners, who were all white men, were very apprehensive. I don't know what they believed anyway, but they were kind of apprehensive about adding more controversy to a league that was on shaky ground to begin with. So there were never any African-American women who played. I can't remember her name, but I read an interview. One of the, there was a woman who played in the Negro baseball leagues, a woman. Just when the men started playing from the quote, colored leagues into Major League Baseball toward the end of the colored leagues, they had women who were allowed to play in those leagues. And she was a pitcher in those leagues. And she did very well. She was trained by Satchel Paige, if you know baseball. And she said in one of the interviews that she had tried out for the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, and she's really glad they wouldn't let her play, because then she got to play in the Negro leagues. And the play was much better, and it was a lot more fun. Yeah, I've wondered the same thing. It's a great question. Yes?
Did they ever play in exhibition games against men teams, male teams, or the professional teams when they came back from the war?
No, not at least as part of the organized league play. They were separate. But then, as I mentioned, when the league folded, then they had a barnstorming team that for 3 years played only against men's teams around the country, but not while, at least to my knowledge, not while the league was fully functioning.
But not any of the major?
No. But one of the, for me, one of the nice twist of fate stories, several of the girls came from baseball families. They had fathers or aunts fathers or uncles or grandfathers who were professional baseball players, minor or major league baseball players, and they just started playing ball at a young age, tagging along their fathers. One of the players in the league, Annabelle Lee, taught her nephew how to play baseball. And if you know baseball, his name was Bill Lee, known as the Spaceman. So she taught her nephew, and he eventually became a professional baseball player. That was a nice little twist. Yes?
You got any of your books here?
No, I don't. I've got one just to show you. If you go on the website of the Wisconsin Historical Society Press, you could order it through them.